Long before the first cities rose from mud and reed, before stone was taught to remember names, there are accounts that speak of a time when the sky did not feel distant. They describe beings who did not crawl out of caves or stumble blindly toward civilization, but arrived already knowing how to measure the stars, bend metals, and command floods. They speak of an age when humanity did not invent knowledge, but received it. This sounds impossible only if we assume the past was simple, linear, and small. Why did primitive hunter-gatherers suddenly organize into complex societies without a gradual transition? Why do the oldest myths insist that teachers came down from above rather than rising from below? Why do flood stories appear on every continent, described not as local disasters but as global resets? Why are the earliest records obsessed with watchers, judges, and guardians who were neither fully human nor fully divine? And why do so many of these accounts vanish from official history, dismissed as metaphor the moment they become uncomfortable? If ancient people were merely imagining these things, why do their descriptions repeat the same structures, the same hierarchies, the same catastrophic cycles across cultures that never met? And if they were not imagining them, what does that say about who we really are and how our story truly began? Before we dive deeper, ignite that like button and prepare for the revelations to come. Tell me in the comments where you are listening from, what time it is there. And as always with our videos, the visuals are here to add context, but they aren't necessary to follow along. Thank you for always having our back. Prepare yourself, and let's dive in. The discovery began without ceremony, without prophecy, without any sense that history was about to fracture. In the late 1940s, on the edge of a dry, unforgiving landscape near the Dead Sea, a group of teenagers wandered the hills tending sheep, killing time by throwing stones into the dark mouths of caves carved into limestone cliffs. One stone struck something fragile. The sound was sharp, unmistakable, the sound of clay breaking in a place where no one expected human hands to have worked. Inside the cave were jars sealed and forgotten, their contents wrapped and hidden with deliberate care. What emerged from those jars would not simply add a footnote to history. It would reopen questions that had been sealed for nearly 2,000 years. The manuscripts recovered from that region, eventually numbering in the hundreds, were written in languages already ancient when Rome was young. Some aligned with familiar biblical texts, but others did not. Among these non-canonical writings was a collection that stood apart not for poetry or moral instruction, but for the scope of its claims. These texts described beings who descended from the sky, who observed humanity not as equals, but as overseers. They described knowledge imparted too early, boundaries crossed, and consequences imposed on a planetary scale. This body of writing would later be known as the Book of Enoch, attributed to a figure mentioned only briefly in the Bible, a man who, according to Genesis, did not die, but vanished. The story these writings told was not subtle. It spoke of watchers sent to Earth at a remote and undefined time, tasked with observation rather than interference. Over time, the watchers abandoned their role. They formed relationships with human women, producing offspring described as enormous in size and appetite, beings who consumed resources and destabilized the world around them. The text does not describe this as symbolism. It describes it as violation. Knowledge was shared that altered human behavior, from metalworking to cosmology, from warfare to ritual. The planet, as described by the text, could no longer sustain the imbalance. Enoch himself is portrayed not as a prophet in the later religious sense, but as a mediator. He moves between realms, conveying messages between humanity, the Watchers, and higher authorities. He is shown the structure of the world from above, the paths of stars, the boundaries of oceans, the mechanics of storms. These descriptions are striking not because they are mystical, but because they are observational. Mountains are described as fixed anchors. Winds are described as constrained flows. Lightning is treated as stored force released by design. The language resembles explanation rather than worship. What unsettled early scholars was not simply the content, but its persistence. Variations of the same narrative appeared far beyond the Near East. In Mesopotamian texts, beings described as having come from the sky establish order, teach agriculture, organize cities, and rule as kings. In those accounts, humanity is shaped through deliberate design rather than spontaneous evolution. The names differ, but the roles remain constant: teachers, overseers, lawgivers, judges. When disaster strikes, it is framed not as chance, but as correction. Flood narratives offer the clearest overlap. From Mesopotamia to the Levant, from the Indus Valley to the Americas, ancient cultures record a catastrophic inundation that erased prior civilizations. These are not vague myths of heavy rain. They describe rising seas, collapsing coastlines, displaced populations, and survivors guided by warning and instruction. In the Mesopotamian epic of Gilgamesh, the flood is explained as a decision made by higher powers disturbed by human overpopulation and noise, language that mirrors complaints found in other ancient sources. Survival is granted not to the strongest, but to the informed. The Book of Enoch places this disaster within a broader moral and cosmic framework. The flood is not punishment for ordinary human failure, but a response to interference that altered humanity's trajectory. The Watchers are imprisoned beneath the earth. Their offspring are destroyed. The world is reset. What remains afterward is a narrower, more constrained humanity, stripped of direct access to the knowledge that once accelerated its development. Civilization, from this point forward, must be rebuilt slowly. This raises a difficult question. If these stories are fabrications, why do they preserve such consistent structure across independent cultures? And if they are metaphorical, what exactly are they metaphors for? The argument that ancient people lacked imagination fails to explain why they imagined the same hierarchy, the same disasters, and the same sequence of events across continents. Metaphor does not replicate itself with architectural precision. The removal of the Book of Enoch from the biblical canon deepens the puzzle. Early Christian writers referenced it freely. Passages from it appear echoed in the New Testament, particularly in descriptions of angels, judgment, and cosmic order. Its exclusion was not the result of a single decision, but a gradual narrowing of acceptable narrative. Texts that complicated doctrine, that blurred the boundary between divine and material, were quietly set aside. What remained was a cleaner story, easier to teach, easier to control. Yet the ideas did not disappear. They resurfaced under different names, embedded in myths, legends, and later philosophical traditions. In Greek thought, a figure associated with wisdom and measurement bridges heaven and earth, teaching writing and science. In Egyptian tradition, a divine scribe records cosmic law and oversees the balance between chaos and order. Across these cultures, knowledge is not discovered, it is inherited. Archaeology adds another layer of tension. The sudden appearance of agriculture, urban planning, and astronomy at the end of the last ice age challenges linear models of development. Sites dating back over 10,000 years show sophisticated understanding of seasonal cycles, geometry, and resource management. These innovations do not appear as experiments, they appear fully formed. The gap between primitive survival and organized civilization is narrow where it should be wide. Mainstream explanations attribute this to gradual cultural accumulation that left few traces. But absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, especially when evidence exists that points in a different direction. Ancient texts insist that humanity was taught, guided, and corrected by forces it did not fully understand. They insist that knowledge arrived before humanity was ready to wield it responsibly. Whether one interprets these accounts as literal, symbolic, or something in between, their persistence demands attention. They are not marginal stories clinging to the edges of history. They sit at the foundation of civilization itself. To dismiss them outright is to assume that ancient people were universally mistaken about their own origins, while modern observers are uniquely immune to error. What emerges from these early accounts is not a comforting story of inevitable progress, but a fragile one of interrupted ascent. Humanity is not portrayed as the natural apex of intelligence on Earth, but as a derivative form, shaped by intervention, then constrained by its removal. Civilization, in this view, is not a steady climb, but a recovery process, rebuilding toward a level once briefly reached and then lost. The question is no longer whether these stories are strange. The question is why they exist at all, and why they refuse to disappear. If they were merely fantasies, time would have eroded them into obscurity. Instead, they remain embedded in the earliest layers of recorded memory, waiting to be re-examined by a civilization once again capable of asking questions it was taught to forget. The figure at the center of these forbidden accounts does not behave like a mythic hero or a symbolic abstraction. He is not introduced through lineage or conquest, but through disappearance. In the brief biblical references that survive, he walks with a higher authority and then is no longer present. No death is recorded. No burial place is named. This absence is not treated as mystery by the text itself, but as fact, a detail that required no elaboration for its original audience. It is only later readers who become uneasy with such an ending. Outside the official canon, that absence is filled with detail. The writings attributed to him describe movement rather than ascension, travel rather than transcendence. He is taken, instructed, returned, and taken again. The language does not emphasize worship or devotion, but observation and record-keeping. He measures time by celestial motion, explains the division of the year by solar rhythm, and describes the world as a structured system governed by rules rather than whim. Knowledge is presented as something external, transferable, and dangerous if mishandled. This portrayal complicates later theological frameworks. It blurs the boundary between divine revelation and technical instruction. The heavens are not described as a purely spiritual realm, but as a layered environment with boundaries, paths, and mechanisms. Stars move along assigned routes, winds are constrained by gates, light behaves according to principles that can be catalogued. These descriptions feel closer to natural philosophy than to religious allegory, which may explain why they became uncomfortable as doctrine hardened. As religious institutions expanded, unity became a priority. Diverse texts circulating among early communities created competing interpretations of authority, salvation, and origin. Some writings emphasized moral obedience. Others emphasized secret knowledge. Those that suggested humanity had once interacted directly with powerful non-human beings introduced implications that were difficult to reconcile with a centralized, hierarchical church. If knowledge once came from outside humanity, it raised questions about who controlled it now. The process of canon formation unfolded gradually over centuries. Contrary to popular imagination, there was no single meeting where books were voted in or out. Instead, texts were copied, quoted, disputed, and eventually marginalized. Writings that aligned with emerging doctrine were preserved. Those that complicated it were labeled unreliable, symbolic, or heretical. The Book of Enoch fell into this latter category, not because it was unknown, but because it was too well known. Other excluded texts reveal similar patterns. One describes a resurrected figure emerging from a tomb, accompanied by towering beings whose heads reached into the clouds, followed by an object that speaks. Another portrays a woman as a primary recipient of instruction, challenging assumptions about authority and hierarchy. These writings were not removed for lack of imagination, but for excess of implication. They introduced imagery that expanded the scale of sacred history beyond comfortable limits. Yet traces of these suppressed ideas remain embedded in accepted scripture. References to angels imprisoned beneath the earth, to giants who once walked the land, to knowledge revealed before time, all echo earlier sources. The language persists even when its context is stripped away. This creates a fragmented narrative where conclusions survive without premises, effects without causes. The result is a tradition haunted by remnants it no longer fully explains. Across cultures, the same figure reappears under different names, always associated with wisdom, measurement, and mediation between realms. In one tradition, he is a scribe of the gods, keeper of cosmic order, and architect of sacred knowledge. In another, he is a lawgiver who teaches writing, mathematics, and astronomy. These roles are remarkably consistent despite linguistic and geographic separation. The function remains stable even as the mythology shifts. Archaeological timelines add weight to the mystery. The emergence of writing, standardized measurement, and astronomical observation occurs abruptly in several early civilizations. The leap from symbolic marks to fully developed scripts appears without intermediate stages. Calendrical systems track lunar and solar cycles with precision that implies long-term observation. These developments suggest inheritance rather than experimentation, transmission rather than invention. The figure associated with these systems is often described as predating a global catastrophe. He preserves knowledge so it survives destruction. In flood narratives, information is not lost by accident, but safeguarded intentionally. Selected individuals are instructed to carry seeds, records, and tools through disaster. Afterward, civilization resumes not from ignorance, but from stored memory. This implies continuity across catastrophe, a thread that official history struggles to accommodate. What is striking is how rarely these traditions portray humanity as fully autonomous. Humans are taught, corrected, warned, and restrained. Their progress is not celebrated unconditionally. Knowledge accelerates growth, but also amplifies destruction. When boundaries are crossed, intervention follows. The flood in these accounts is not arbitrary. It is corrective, a response to imbalance introduced by premature advancement. The exclusion of these narratives did not erase their influence. They migrated into philosophy, mysticism, and folklore. They resurfaced in medieval alchemy, Renaissance cosmology, and modern speculative thought. Each time they reappear, they carry the same underlying suggestion: that human history did not begin at the ground level, but at a midpoint following an earlier ascent. Modern discomfort with these ideas often stems from their challenge to linear progress. If humanity was once guided and then abandoned, it implies regression as well as advancement. It suggests that technological and cultural achievements may represent recovery rather than novelty. This reframing destabilizes assumptions about modern superiority and inevitability. The figure once reduced to a footnote becomes, in this light, a hinge point between eras. Not a god, not merely a man, but a conduit through which knowledge passed briefly before being withdrawn. His disappearance marks a closing rather than a beginning, the sealing of a channel that once connected humanity to something beyond itself. What remains after his departure is a quieter world. The sky recedes, knowledge fragments, stories replace instruction. Civilization continues, but slower, constrained by memory rather than guidance. The ancient texts do not mourn this loss openly. They record it. And in doing so, they leave behind a question that refuses resolution: whether humanity is moving forward for the first time or trying to remember something it once knew. When the ancient texts speak of the offspring born from the union between watchers and humans, they do not describe a subtle change. They describe disruption on a physical scale that altered landscapes, food systems, and social balance. These beings are portrayed as enormous, consuming more than ordinary humans could produce, destabilizing early settlements that relied on fragile agricultural rhythms. The problem was not merely moral, but logistical. A world calibrated for small cooperative communities could not support creatures whose size and strength placed them outside the existing ecological limits. Descriptions of these offspring emphasize appetite and excess. Crops were stripped faster than they could be replanted. Livestock vanished. Violence followed scarcity, not as a cultural trait, but as an inevitability. In this context, the ancient flood narratives acquire a practical dimension. Rising waters do not merely cleanse symbolically. They erase systems that have exceeded their capacity. Catastrophe becomes a reset mechanism rather than divine rage. What is often overlooked is how widely this pattern appears. In Mesopotamian accounts, semi-divine rulers dominate the earliest dynasties, reigning for spans of time that stretch far beyond human lifespans. These reigns are recorded not as mythic exaggeration, but as administrative fact, measured and catalogued. Later dynasties shorten abruptly, as though something fundamental changed. The transition is not gradual, it is sharp, marked by disaster and reorganization. Across the Mediterranean, similar figures appear in early Greek memory. Heroes are not merely skilled warriors, but hybrids of divine and human lineage, larger than life both physically and morally. They build cities, move stones beyond the capacity of ordinary labor, and fall violently. Their age ends in war and catastrophe, clearing space for smaller, more manageable societies. The narrative rhythm repeats: arrival, dominance, collapse. In Northern Europe, oral traditions speak of ancient builders who shaped coastlines and raised stone rings before retreating or being destroyed. These figures are remembered as giants, not because of poetic license, but because their works dwarf the people who inherit them. Stone structures weighing hundreds or thousands of tons remain embedded in landscapes long after the stories explaining them fade. Later cultures explain these remnants with myth because practical explanation has been lost. Archaeology complicates dismissal. Megalithic sites across the world demonstrate an understanding of weight distribution, leverage, and geometry that challenges assumptions about early technology. The stones were not dragged randomly. They were placed with precision, aligned to celestial events, embedded into foundations engineered to endure seismic movement. These are not the marks of improvisation. They reflect planning informed by experience. The conventional explanation attributes this to lost techniques rather than lost beings. Yet this does not account for the persistence of giant imagery in connection with construction. In region after region, monumental architecture is attributed to a prior race remembered for size and strength. The builders are always gone by the time writing appears. Their absence is consistent. Their legacy is not. Biblical texts, often cited selectively, preserve fragments of this older memory. They list territories described explicitly as lands once occupied by giants. They record reconnaissance missions where ordinary men compare themselves to insects in scale. These descriptions are not metaphorical comparisons of fear. They are spatial observations. Height, breadth, mass are measured and noted. What follows these encounters is systematic elimination. The texts describe campaigns not merely to conquer land, but to remove a population defined by size and lineage. The language shifts from political conflict to extermination. Survival of these beings is framed as unacceptable, not because of their beliefs, but because of what they are. The implication is that coexistence is impossible. Outside religious tradition, historical records from explorers echo similar encounters. Early travelers report meeting populations significantly taller than themselves, often with unusual proportions. These accounts are treated today as exaggeration or misinterpretation. Yet they were recorded by individuals tasked with accuracy, writing for patrons who demanded reliability. The repetition of such reports across independent expeditions challenges casual dismissal. Physical evidence has surfaced intermittently, only to vanish. Newspaper archives from the 19th and early 20th centuries contain reports of oversized skeletons unearthed during construction and excavation. These discoveries attracted attention briefly, then disappeared from public record. Official explanations point to misidentified animal remains or measurement errors. Yet the consistency of these reports, often accompanied by photographs and eyewitness testimony, suggests a more complex reality. The difficulty lies not in accepting that anomalies existed, but in integrating them into a coherent narrative. Modern evolutionary models accommodate variation, but not extremes that destabilize population dynamics. A race significantly larger than modern humans would require different caloric intake, different social organization, and different reproductive patterns. Such a population would leave traces not only in bone, but in myth, memory, and fear. Ancient traditions preserve precisely that fear. Giants are not portrayed as benevolent elders, but as destabilizing forces. They consume too much, dominate too completely, and provoke correction. Their destruction is rarely mourned. It is justified as necessary for balance. The flood, the wars, the purges are framed as restoration rather than tragedy. This framing aligns with a broader theme present in the oldest accounts. Humanity exists within constraints imposed by higher systems. When those constraints are violated, correction follows. Whether the violators are watchers who interfere too directly or offspring who exceed sustainable limits, the response is the same. Removal precedes renewal. After these events, something changes in human self-perception. Texts written after the catastrophe emphasize obedience, humility, and separation from the divine. The era of direct interaction ends. Knowledge becomes fragmented, encoded into ritual and story, rather than transmitted openly, where kinds recede into legend. The sky becomes symbolic rather than accessible. What remains are stones too large to ignore, stories too consistent to erase, and texts too uncomfortable to include. Together, they suggest that the ancient world remembered a phase of existence fundamentally different from the one that followed. A phase where humanity was not alone, not equal, and not fully in control of its development. The persistence of giant traditions across time and geography is not evidence of shared fantasy, but of shared memory filtered through survival. Cultures that endured catastrophe preserved what they could, simplifying and mythologizing as needed. Size became symbol, power became divinity, and intervention became judgment. But beneath the layers of retelling, the outline remains intact. If these beings never existed, then humanity invented the same explanation for its monuments, disasters, and origins again and again, independently, across continents. If they did exist, then history begins not with ignorance, but with aftermath. In either case, the conventional story of slow, uninterrupted progress fails to account for the depth and consistency of what ancient people insisted they remembered. After the catastrophe that erased the age of giants and scattered the remnants of earlier knowledge, human societies did not restart from emptiness. They reorganized around memory fragments, rituals, and inherited instruction that no longer had a living source. This is where the earliest recognizable civilizations emerge, not as experiments in survival, but as structured systems already aware of law, measurement, and hierarchy. The land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers becomes especially important in this transition, not because it is fertile alone, but because it preserves the clearest record of what came before. Clay tablets from this region do not begin with creation myths in the abstract. They begin with administration. They list rulers, assign labor, measure fields, and record celestial movements with precision that implies long-standing practice. Kingship is presented as something transferred rather than invented. Authority descends, not upward from a popular consensus, but downward from a higher order that once ruled directly. The earliest rulers are not elected or chosen by strength. They are designated. In these records, the rulers of the earliest dynasties are described as reigning for extraordinary spans of time. Their lifespans stretch into tens of thousands of years. These durations are not poetic flourishes. They are written using the same numerical system employed for accounting grain and livestock. When the catastrophe is recorded, these reigns end abruptly. Subsequent kings rule for lifetimes recognizable to modern humans. The change is sudden and absolute. This division marks a boundary in memory. Before it, the world is governed by beings whose longevity and authority exceed human scale. After it, humans rule themselves, though still under the shadow of former masters. The language used to describe these earlier rulers does not treat them as metaphorical gods. They eat, travel, argue, and make mistakes. They are powerful, but not omnipotent. Their authority is enforced, not assumed. Agriculture expands rapidly during this period, not as a gradual experiment, but as a complete system. Crops are domesticated, irrigation channels engineered, and seasonal cycles tracked with accuracy that requires long-term observation. The sudden coordination of labor suggests centralized planning rather than spontaneous adaptation. Settlements are laid out deliberately, aligned with waterways and cardinal directions, reflecting knowledge of landscape and geometry. Writing appears fully formed. Symbols correspond to sounds, quantities, and abstract concepts without intermediate stages preserved in the archaeological record. This is not how invention usually unfolds. Tools evolve through visible trial and error. Writing arrives as a finished instrument. It functions immediately as a vehicle for law, economy, and cosmology. The people who use it behave as though they are learning to apply it, not invent it. Astronomy is embedded into daily life. The movements of planets are tracked. Eclipses are recorded. Time is divided into units still used today. These observations are not casual. They require generations of data collection. Yet they appear at the beginning of recorded history, not the end. This suggests inheritance from a prior observational tradition, one that did not survive intact. Religious practice during this era reflects caution rather than devotion. Temples are constructed as administrative centers as much as places of worship. Offerings are standardized. Rituals follow strict procedures. The gods are addressed not with affection, but with negotiation. They are powerful landlords rather than benevolent parents. This tone reflects memory of direct interaction with authority that could punish unpredictably. The stories preserved alongside administrative records reinforce this attitude. Floods are remembered as decisions. Diseases are sent deliberately. Knowledge is withheld intentionally. Humanity is portrayed as a labor force created to maintain order after a rebellion among higher beings. These narratives do not flatter humanity. They define it as useful, replaceable, and limited. What is striking is the absence of curiosity about origins in these texts. The writers do not ask where the gods came from. They assume their presence as fact. The question that dominates instead is how to avoid provoking them. Rules are established, boundaries are enforced. Transgression is punished not symbolically, but materially through famine, flood, or conquest. This worldview produces stable but constrained societies. Innovation occurs within limits. Knowledge advances incrementally, but never approaches the scale described in the older accounts. Monumental architecture continues, but without the impossible feats attributed to earlier ages. Stones are still moved, but fewer are set beyond human scale. The ambition of construction narrows. Over time, memory degrades. Direct references to non-human rulers soften into myth. Longevity becomes symbolic. Catastrophe becomes moral allegory. The sharp edges of history are dulled to fit narrative comfort. Yet traces remain. Measurements encoded in architecture preserve astronomical alignments long after their purpose is forgotten. Myths preserve outlines of events stripped of context. As civilizations rise and fall, these fragments are repackaged. New empires inherit old temples, rename old gods, and reinterpret old disasters. Each iteration moves further from the source while insisting continuity. What was once record becomes legend. What was once instruction becomes ritual. The distance between humanity and its formative influence widens. This process does not eliminate the original structure. It obscures it. Beneath layers of retelling, the same pattern persists. Arrival of superior beings, transmission of knowledge, violation of boundaries, catastrophe, withdrawal, and constrained recovery. This pattern does not belong to one culture or one region. It defines the shared memory of early civilization. The transition from the age before the flood to the age after does not represent progress in the modern sense. It represents survival. Humanity continues not because it mastered its environment, but because it adapted to the absence of guidance. The world becomes quieter. The sky becomes symbolic. Authority becomes human. Yet the longing for what was lost does not disappear. It is preserved in stories of golden ages, divine kings, and vanished teachers. Civilization moves forward, carrying the weight of an origin it no longer fully understands, repeating structures without remembering why they were built that way. In this light, early civilization is not the dawn of human greatness, but the shadow of something greater that receded. What follows is not creation, but reconstruction. And the foundations of that reconstruction are laid not on ignorance, but on fragments of a past that refuses to stay buried. As generations passed, the memory of direct intervention faded, but its imprint remained embedded in bloodlines, geography, and authority. Kingship across early civilizations was never framed as a social contract. It was framed as inheritance from a time when rulers were not merely human. The earliest monarchs were described as intermediaries, carrying legitimacy that did not originate among the people, but descended from above. This legitimacy was reinforced through ritual, architecture, and controlled knowledge, ensuring that power appeared continuous even as its source vanished. Royal lineages emphasized descent over merit. Genealogy mattered more than competence because ancestry linked rulers to a former order. In many cultures, kings were not simply leaders but living symbols of cosmic balance. Their health reflected the land's fertility. Their failure invited famine or invasion. This belief system only makes sense in a world where authority was once enforced externally, where leadership was not chosen but imposed, and where human rulers served as replacements for absent overseers. Sacred architecture functioned as memory storage. Temples and monuments were built on sites associated with earlier presence, often atop older foundations whose origins were already obscure. These structures were aligned with celestial events, not for aesthetic reasons, but to maintain synchronization with a system that once governed time and order. Even when the original rationale was forgotten, the alignments persisted, repeated out of tradition rather than understanding. Across continents, pyramidal structures appear independently yet follow similar principles. Their placement, orientation, and proportions reflect advanced geometric knowledge. The builders did not experiment publicly. They executed with confidence. This suggests instruction rather than discovery, repetition rather than innovation. Later cultures inherited these forms and copied them with diminishing precision, preserving the shape while losing the underlying logic. Knowledge became stratified. What had once been shared openly was now restricted to priestly classes. Astronomy, medicine, and mathematics were guarded as sacred arts. Writing systems encoded information in ways accessible only to initiates. This was not elitism born of vanity, but containment born of caution. Knowledge had once brought catastrophe. Limiting its spread became a survival strategy. Myths from this period emphasize boundaries. Humans are warned not to look too closely, climb too high, or question too deeply. Curiosity becomes transgression. Obedience becomes virtue. These values do not arise naturally in exploratory societies. They arise in cultures that remember punishment for overreach. The stories function as psychological barriers, preventing repetition of earlier mistakes. Even technological development reflects this restraint. Tools improve incrementally. Materials are refined. Techniques advance, but never explosively. There is no sudden leap comparable to the earlier transformation described in the oldest texts. Progress becomes cautious, grounded, incremental. Humanity learns to operate within limits rather than testing them. Language itself carries evidence of this shift. Words associated with light, fire, and ascent acquire moral weight. They are associated with danger and prohibition. Darkness, earth, and humility are framed as safe. This inversion suggests a cultural retreat from the sky toward the ground, from ambition toward endurance. The memory of giants and watchers becomes moralized. What were once descriptions of scale and power become warnings against pride. Stories that may have recorded physical reality are reframed as lessons. Size becomes arrogance, strength becomes corruption. The beings themselves fade, but the cautionary tone remains. Yet not all traces are softened. In remote regions, legends persist with sharper edges. Tales of massive builders, hidden valleys, and forbidden mountains survive outside institutional control. These stories are often dismissed as folklore, but they preserve details absent from sanitized traditions. They speak of encounters rather than allegories, of fear rather than moral instruction. Explorers and chroniclers who ventured beyond established centers of power occasionally recorded such encounters. They described people of unusual stature, landscapes shaped by forces beyond human labor, and ruins attributed to prior inhabitants, unlike those currently present. These accounts were often sidelined or rationalized away, not because they were implausible, but because they did not fit the accepted narrative of human development. The consolidation of empires accelerated this process of normalization. Centralized authority required a stable origin story. Chaos, intervention, and regression threatened legitimacy. History was streamlined. Inconvenient elements were removed or reframed. What remained was a story of gradual ascent, guided by divine approval rather than external control. Education reinforced this model. Young generations were taught continuity rather than rupture. The flood became a moral parable. Giants became metaphors. Teachers from the sky became symbolic angels. Each translation reduced specificity and increased abstraction. Over time, the literal memory dissolved, leaving only structure. Despite this, the pattern refused to disappear. Every civilization preserved a version of an earlier age when the world operated differently. It was always better ordered, more powerful, and closer to the source of knowledge. This golden age was never placed in the future. It was always behind, separated by disaster. The direction of loss was consistent. This backward-looking orientation contradicts modern assumptions about progress. It suggests that humanity measures itself against a remembered standard rather than an imagined future. Innovation becomes recovery. Mastery becomes remembrance. Even modern scientific ambition echoes this impulse, seeking unified laws, hidden structures, and origins beyond immediate perception. The persistence of these themes indicates that early humanity did not perceive itself as the beginning of history. It perceived itself as the continuation of something interrupted. Civilization was not born confident and curious. It was born cautious, constrained, and deeply aware that it once stood closer to forces it could no longer reach. This awareness shaped everything that followed. It dictated how knowledge was treated, how power was justified, and how the past was remembered. The world that emerges from this period is not naive. It is traumatized, disciplined by memory, and determined not to repeat an error it only partially understands. In that determination lies the paradox of human history. Progress unfolds within boundaries established by a forgotten failure. Advancement continues, but always with an undercurrent of restraint, as if the species knows, instinctively, that there are doors it once opened too early, and that some distances, once crossed, carry consequences too severe to risk again. As centuries turned into millennia, the memory of catastrophe hardened into doctrine, and doctrine reshaped how humanity understood its place in the world. The relationship between humans and the forces once described as rulers or watchers transformed into one of distance and fear. Where earlier accounts described dialogue, later traditions emphasized silence. The sky no longer spoke, it judged. This shift marks a psychological boundary as significant as any flood or war, because it altered not only belief, but behavior. The gods of later civilizations were no longer teachers walking among humans. They became remote authorities whose will was interpreted by intermediaries. Communication moved from direct instruction to ritualized appeal. Sacrifice replaced conversation. Prayer replaced negotiation. This was not merely theological evolution, but an adaptation to absence. When guidance is withdrawn, structure must replace presence. Law codes emerge during this period with striking rigidity. They do not read like evolving social agreements, but like constraints designed to prevent deviation. Penalties are severe. Transgression is framed not as error, but as threat to cosmic order. The language used suggests that disorder invites external correction, echoing older memories of catastrophe triggered by imbalance. These legal systems are often attributed to divine origin. Tablets, pillars, and scrolls are said to be delivered rather than composed. This reinforces the idea that humans are custodians of rules they did not create. Even when the source is no longer physically present, authority is preserved by claiming continuity with it. The past becomes immutable reference. Urban design reflects the same mentality. Cities are planned with strict hierarchies. Sacred spaces are elevated, restricted, and separated from ordinary life. Access is controlled, movement is regulated. These are not the traits of spontaneous growth, but of systems designed to enforce order from the top down. The memory of chaos informs every wall and gate. Human identity shifts accordingly. Earlier traditions describe humanity as altered by contact with powerful beings. Later traditions emphasize humanity's inferiority and need for guidance. The idea that humans might equal or surpass their former overseers becomes taboo. Aspiration is reframed as hubris. The desire to ascend becomes a moral failure. Stories from this era repeatedly warn against reaching too high. Figures who attempt to reclaim lost knowledge are punished. Structures built to approach the heavens are destroyed. Fire stolen from above brings suffering as much as progress. These narratives function as internalized restraints, teaching each generation where not to look. Yet the impulse to remember does not vanish. It is redirected. Instead of seeking direct contact, humanity begins to study the remnants left behind. Astronomy becomes observation rather than communion. Mathematics becomes abstraction rather than instruction. Engineering becomes imitation rather than replication. Progress continues, but along safer paths. This redirection gives rise to early science. Natural phenomena are catalogued, named, and predicted without invoking direct divine action. Storms follow patterns. Seasons cycle predictably. The world becomes understandable within limits. This is not a rejection of the earlier order, but an accommodation to its absence. Humans learn to work with what remains. Still, anomalies persist. Certain sites retain an aura of prohibition. Mountains, caves, and ruins are marked as forbidden or sacred, not because of immediate danger, but because of inherited warning. These locations are often associated with earlier presence, remembered vaguely as dwellings of gods or giants. Even when stripped of narrative detail, the caution remains. Artifacts discovered in these places frequently resist easy classification. Objects appear technologically advanced relative to their context, or constructed with materials and precision difficult to reconcile with known capabilities. These discoveries provoke fascination and unease. They hint at continuity between eras that doctrine insists are separate. Responses to such findings follow a predictable pattern. They are reinterpreted to fit accepted frameworks or quietly set aside. The priority is stability. Acknowledging evidence of a more advanced past destabilizes the narrative of controlled progress. It reopens the possibility that humanity is not climbing steadily upward, but circling around a lost peak. The tension between curiosity and caution defines this phase of history. On one hand, humans are driven to explore, measure, and understand. On the other, they are constrained by inherited fear of repeating an ancient mistake. This produces a culture of compartmentalization, where certain questions are permitted and others forbidden. Education mirrors this divide. Practical knowledge is encouraged. Metaphysical inquiry is regulated. The origins of the world are taught selectively, framed in ways that reinforce obedience rather than investigation. Mystery becomes sacred rather than solvable. This preserves cohesion at the cost of comprehension. Over time, the original events recede further into abstraction. Giants become symbols. Watchers become angels. Catastrophe becomes sin. The underlying structure remains, but its components are renamed and moralized. This allows the memory to survive without threatening the established order. Myth becomes a containment vessel for history. Despite this transformation, the consistency of the underlying narrative persists. Humanity once interacted with forces beyond itself. That interaction produced both advancement and destruction. The aftermath required restraint. Civilization rebuilt under new rules. These themes are repeated endlessly, adapted to local culture and language, but never erased. What changes most is tone. Early accounts are descriptive. Later ones are prescriptive. They tell people not what happened, but how to behave because of what happened. The past becomes instruction rather than record. This shift ensures survival, but obscures origin. In this environment, humanity becomes increasingly self-reliant. Tools improve, societies expand, empires rise, yet a subtle ceiling remains. Certain technologies do not reappear. Certain scales are not attempted again. The stones grow smaller. The sky grows farther away. The loss is not overtly acknowledged, but it is felt. It manifests as nostalgia for golden ages, divine kings, and lost wisdom. It surfaces in art, philosophy, and later in science fiction. The same questions resurface under new disguises, driven by the same unresolved memory. This phase of history does not represent ignorance overcoming myth. It represents adaptation to absence. Humanity learns to function without direct oversight, carrying fragments of a past that once overwhelmed it. Progress becomes cautious, bounded by lessons learned at great cost. In this balance between memory and restraint, civilization stabilizes. It survives, grows, and diversifies. But beneath its achievements lies a quiet acknowledgement, passed down through story and structure alike, that the world was once governed by forces now gone, and that their departure defined the limits within which humanity still lives. As human societies stabilized within the boundaries imposed by memory and restraint, a new phenomenon emerged that would quietly reshape the relationship between myth and reality: the systematic rewriting of origins. This did not occur through overt deception, but through selective emphasis. Stories were not erased outright. They were reframed, softened, and reorganized to support continuity rather than rupture. The past became a moral archive instead of a historical record. This process is visible in how earlier figures were transformed. Beings once described as rulers of flesh and blood were elevated into abstract divinities. Their physicality dissolved. Their limitations vanished. What had been remembered as authority backed by power became authority backed by omnipotence. This shift removed uncomfortable questions about vulnerability, conflict, and succession. Gods could no longer fall because they were never embodied to begin with. The same transformation affected catastrophe. Floods, fires, and celestial disturbances were detached from external causation and recast as moral judgment. Human behavior became the sole trigger. This narrative change served an important function. If disaster was punishment for disobedience, then obedience promised safety. The unpredictability of external forces was replaced with the illusion of control through behavior. Textual traditions from this period reveal careful editing. Earlier versions of stories exist alongside later ones, sharing structure but differing in emphasis. Details related to physical interaction, instruction, or technology are reduced or removed. What remains is ethical teaching. The story still explains why the world is the way it is, but no longer how it became that way. This refinement coincides with the rise of centralized religious institutions. Authority required a stable cosmology, one that justified hierarchy and obedience without inviting speculation about alternative power sources. If gods once walked among humans, it implied that power could return in similar form. That possibility was destabilizing. Distance ensured permanence. As a result, knowledge transmission became symbolic. Architectural forms preserved proportions without explaining their origin. Rituals repeated gestures whose original purpose was forgotten. Calendars tracked cycles whose observational foundations were no longer taught. Civilization continued to function, but increasingly on inherited templates rather than understanding. This pattern extended to language. Terms once used to describe tangible phenomena were repurposed to describe moral states. Light ceased to be energy and became virtue. Fire ceased to be technology and became temptation. Ascent ceased to be movement and became pride. Language itself became a tool of containment, redirecting attention away from material reality. Yet evidence of the earlier framework persisted in unexpected places. Astronomical alignments embedded in ancient structures continued to function, regardless of belief. Mathematical constants encoded into monuments remained accurate. These features did not require faith. They required precision. Their survival challenges the notion that ancient builders operated solely within symbolic thinking. The tension between inherited structure and revised narrative produced contradictions. Official doctrine emphasized humility and limitation, while inherited architecture spoke of ambition and mastery. Sacred texts warned against reaching too high, while temples pointed deliberately toward the sky. Civilization lived within this contradiction, rarely acknowledging it directly. Over time, this dissonance was normalized. People learned to compartmentalize. They revered monuments without asking who designed them. They repeated rituals without knowing why they worked. Function replaced comprehension. Stability mattered more than origin. Occasionally, individuals attempted to bridge this gap. Philosophers, mystics, and scholars questioned inconsistencies, comparing myths across cultures and noticing shared frameworks beneath differing names. These efforts were often marginalized. Cross-cultural comparison threatened local authority by revealing that no tradition stood alone. When empires expanded, they absorbed foreign gods and stories, blending them into their own frameworks. This process preserved structure while altering surface details. A sky god in one culture became a sun god in another, then a principle rather than a being. The continuity of roles mattered more than their labels. This blending further diluted memory. As stories merged, specificity eroded. Giants became heroes, then demigods, then metaphors. Watchers became angels, then abstractions of conscience. Each step moved the narrative further from material interpretation. Despite this dilution, the emotional core of the stories endured. Fear of overreach remained. Reverence for lost knowledge persisted. Longing for a vanished golden age continued to shape aspiration. Even stripped of context, these emotions guided behavior. The emergence of historical writing intensified this trend. Chroniclers prioritized lineage, conquest, and legitimacy. Events that did not serve these goals were omitted or simplified. History became a tool of governance. What could not be controlled was excluded. Yet history written this way always contains gaps. Those gaps attract attention. Ruins without explanation, artifacts without origin, and myths without clear moral resolution resist closure. They invite reconsideration, even when discouraged. The result is a layered civilization built atop unresolved questions. Each era adds interpretation without fully resolving what came before. The deeper layers remain intact, exerting pressure on the surface narrative. This pressure explains why certain ideas resurface repeatedly despite suppression. The notion that humanity was altered, guided, or constrained by forces beyond itself refuses to disappear. It adapts, appearing as angels, aliens, advanced ancestors, or lost civilizations, depending on the language of the time. These modern reinterpretations are not new ideas. They are translations of old ones into contemporary terms. Each generation revisits the same unresolved memory using the tools it has available. What remains constant is the unease. Civilization senses that its story is incomplete. It advances technologically while circling the same questions about origin, intervention, and limitation. The progress is real, but the foundation feels provisional. This stage of history is defined not by ignorance, but by managed forgetting. Humanity knows enough to function, but not enough to challenge the boundaries imposed long ago. The silence of the sky is accepted as normal, even as traces of a time when it spoke remain embedded in stone and story. In that silence, the past waits. Not erased, not defeated, but translated into forms that can be tolerated. And as long as those forms persist, the deeper narrative remains accessible to anyone willing to look beyond the surface and recognize that history, as preserved, is only the final layer of a much older structure. As written history solidified into official record, exploration pushed humanity into regions far beyond the centers where doctrine and narrative control were strongest. In these peripheral spaces, memory behaved differently. Isolated communities preserved accounts that had been softened or erased elsewhere, not because they were more accurate, but because they were less managed. Distance from centralized authority allowed older frameworks to survive with sharper edges. Travelers who entered these regions often recorded experiences that did not align with accepted models of human development. They described encounters with people of unusual stature, landscapes shaped by forces exceeding known methods, and ruins attributed to inhabitants no longer present. These observations were documented not as myths, but as reports, written by individuals whose reputations depended on credibility. Such accounts appear repeatedly across centuries of exploration. Sailors reaching distant coasts spoke of towering figures whose proportions differed markedly from their own. Inland expeditions recorded tribes ruled by individuals described as physically dominant beyond ordinary variation. These descriptions were not isolated exaggerations. They followed consistent patterns of height, strength, and social hierarchy. The response to these reports was often dismissal through reinterpretation. Physical difference was explained away as optical illusion, fear, or cultural misunderstanding. Over time, as scientific frameworks developed, these accounts were reframed as folklore rather than data. This shift did not occur because the reports were disproven, but because they resisted integration into emerging evolutionary narratives. Physical evidence surfaced intermittently, reinforcing these accounts. Excavations uncovered oversized tools, unusually proportioned skeletal remains, and architectural features difficult to attribute to known populations. These discoveries were frequently removed from public view, reclassified, or left unpublished. The reasons were rarely stated, but the pattern was consistent. Anomalies were treated as disruptions rather than opportunities for revision. At the same time, mainstream archaeology focused increasingly on continuity. human development was presented as a smooth curve of adaptation and innovation. Gaps were minimized. Outliers were averaged away. This approach stabilized theory, but sacrificed complexity. It assumed that what could not be explained within existing models did not belong to history. Yet the accumulation of unresolved evidence continued. Certain megalithic sites defied explanation, despite advances in engineering analysis. Stone blocks weighing hundreds or thousands of tons were transported and positioned with precision unmatched, even by modern machinery. Explanations invoking lost techniques explained method, but not motive. The scale remained excessive relative to functional need. Local traditions surrounding these sites consistently attributed them to builders unlike present populations. These builders were remembered as giants, not merely tall individuals, but beings whose size defined their role. They were said to shape landforms, alter rivers, and move stones as others moved tools. These stories were not moral lessons. They were explanations. The persistence of these explanations across unrelated cultures challenges the assumption of shared imagination. If human communities independently confronted structures beyond their capacity to replicate, attributing them to prior inhabitants of greater size or power becomes a rational inference rather than fantasy. Memory fills gaps left by evidence. Modern scientific reluctance to engage these narratives often stems from fear of destabilizing established timelines. Acknowledging the existence of a physically distinct population interacting with early humans would require re-evaluating migration, adaptation, and coexistence models. It would complicate a story carefully streamlined for clarity. This reluctance extends beyond giants to other anomalous findings. Advanced knowledge embedded in ancient artifacts, precision mapping predating accepted surveying techniques, and astronomical alignments requiring long-term observation all suggest a deeper past than officially acknowledged. Each case alone might be dismissed. Together, they form a pattern. Institutions respond to such patterns cautiously. Research funding favors incremental refinement over foundational challenge. Careers are built on stability. Radical reinterpretation carries risk. As a result, anomalies are often isolated, studied privately, or left unexplored. Outside academic frameworks, public interest in these anomalies has grown steadily. Alternative histories gain attention not because they are sensational, but because they address unanswered questions. They offer coherence where official narratives provide silence. This does not mean all alternative claims are accurate, but it reflects a genuine hunger for completeness. The language used to discredit these interests often mirrors earlier containment strategies. Skepticism is framed not as inquiry, but as dismissal. Curiosity is equated with gullibility. This discourages exploration without resolving the underlying issues. What emerges is a familiar pattern repeating across time. Knowledge that challenges dominant frameworks is marginalized until a shift makes it unavoidable. The history of science itself demonstrates this repeatedly. Ideas once ridiculed become foundational when evidence accumulates beyond denial. In the case of ancient anomalies, that accumulation is ongoing. New technologies reveal details previously inaccessible. Subsurface scanning uncovers structures buried beneath cities and seas. Genetic research identifies unexpected markers and divergences. Each discovery adds complexity. These developments do not confirm any single narrative, but they undermine the assumption of simplicity. Humanity's past appears layered, fragmented, and marked by interruptions. The idea of a single, uninterrupted evolutionary path grows increasingly difficult to defend. What remains striking is how well this emerging complexity aligns with ancient accounts long dismissed as myth. The themes of prior inhabitants, lost knowledge, and catastrophic resets echo through both tradition and data. The language differs. The structure does not. This alignment does not require literal acceptance of every ancient claim. It requires recognizing that early humans recorded experiences they did not fully understand, using the language available to them. Myth was not fiction. It was translation. Modern science, with its own language and constraints, may be approaching the same boundary from a different direction. As evidence accumulates, the distance between mythic memory and empirical reconstruction narrows. The past becomes less comfortable, but more coherent. The resistance to this convergence is not intellectual alone. It is cultural. Accepting a more complex origin challenges assumptions about human exceptionalism and inevitability. It suggests that progress is contingent, fragile, and reversible. In this light, the persistence of giant narratives, advanced ancient knowledge, and unexplained structures is not an embarrassment. It is a clue. It points to a phase of history that does not fit cleanly into linear models, but which left enough traces to demand attention. As exploration continues, both physical and intellectual, the boundaries of acceptable history may shift once again. When they do, the stories preserved at the margins may move closer to the center, not as curiosities, but as incomplete records finally given context. Until then, civilization lives between certainty and suspicion, aware that its official story explains much, but not everything. And that beyond the edges of the map, both literal and historical, the past remains larger, stranger, and more consequential than it has been allowed to appear. As the modern era approached, humanity developed new tools for interpreting the past, tools grounded in measurement, experimentation, and repeatability. These methods promised clarity, replacing inherited authority with observable evidence. Yet as they were applied to ancient history, they revealed not simplicity, but contradiction. The deeper researchers looked, the more the past resisted clean categorization. Geological studies confirmed that Earth had undergone abrupt and violent transformations within time frames overlapping early human settlement. Ice sheets melted rapidly, sea levels rose dramatically, coastlines shifted, entire regions were submerged. These findings validated ancient flood accounts in structure, if not in language. Catastrophe was no longer a matter of belief, but of data. Marine exploration expanded this realization. Beneath shallow seas, researchers discovered submerged settlements, roads, and walls, preserved by sudden inundation. These structures were not primitive. They reflected organized habitation, implying societies established before rising waters erased them. Their existence forced reconsideration of timelines that placed complex civilization strictly after the last ice age. At the same time, advances in archaeology revealed that early urban centers appeared almost simultaneously in multiple regions. Agriculture, writing, and monumental construction emerged without clear developmental precursors. The speed of this transition challenged models of gradual innovation. Something accelerated change, then withdrew, leaving humanity to stabilize. Genetic research added another layer. Studies identified unexpected markers suggesting complex interbreeding events in deep prehistory. While these findings are often framed in terms of unknown hominin species, the degree of genetic divergence raises questions about interaction between populations more varied than previously assumed. Human origins appear less linear and more braided. Astronomy, too, offered unsettling parallels. Ancient records tracked celestial events with precision that modern scientists initially dismissed as coincidence. Alignments predicted solstices, equinoxes, and planetary cycles with accuracy requiring generations of observation. This data existed before instruments capable of such measurement were believed to exist. When these findings were compared with ancient texts, thematic convergence emerged. Floods, sky watchers, lost ages, and sudden resets appeared repeatedly, not as identical stories, but as structurally consistent ones. Modern language translated these patterns into terms like climate instability and population bottlenecks. Ancient language translated them into judgment and withdrawal. Both described disruption. Despite this convergence, institutional resistance remained strong. Paradigms do not shift easily. Each discipline protects its assumptions. Geology explains floods without addressing cultural memory. Archaeology catalogs ruins without integrating myth. Genetics maps divergence without exploring narrative implications. Knowledge fragments mirror the fragmentation of ancient memory. This compartmentalization creates blind spots. Evidence that spans disciplines often falls between them, unclaimed and unresolved. Ancient accounts occupy this space, dismissed as symbolic yet uncannily aligned with data. They are neither fully accepted nor fully refuted. Public discourse reflects this tension. Popular interest gravitates toward theories that promise coherence, even at the cost of speculation. Critics respond by emphasizing uncertainty, sometimes equating all alternative inquiry with fantasy. The result is polarization rather than synthesis. What is often overlooked is that ancient people were not attempting to deceive. They recorded what they experienced using the frameworks available to them. They described floods as divine decisions because they lacked geophysical terminology. They described sky beings as gods because they lacked aerospace vocabulary. Their language was metaphorical by necessity, not intent. Modern science faces a similar limitation. It describes phenomena in terms of measurable variables, sometimes neglecting experiential dimensions. It explains mechanisms, but often avoids narrative. Both approaches capture partial truth. Neither alone offers completeness. The challenge lies in integration. Accepting that ancient texts may encode empirical observation does not require abandoning critical standards. It requires expanding interpretive frameworks. Myths can be data when decoded carefully, just as data can be myth when stripped of context. Some researchers have begun this integration cautiously. They examine myths alongside geological strata, aligning oral traditions with evidence of earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, and floods. In many cases, the correlations are striking. Stories once dismissed as allegory correspond closely with physical events. This approach reframes ancient narratives as survival tools rather than superstition. Encoding catastrophe into story ensured transmission across generations. Moral framing preserved memory. Ritual reinforced repetition. These were effective strategies for a world without writing or censors. Under this lens, references to watchers and giants can be reconsidered. They may reflect encounters with physically distinct populations, or with technologies perceived as supernatural. They may encode social hierarchies collapsed by disaster. Their literal truth remains uncertain, but their informational value does not. What becomes increasingly clear is that the past was not quiet. It was volatile, interrupted, and crowded with complexity. Humanity did not emerge gently into civilization. It endured shock, loss, and adaptation. The stories it told reflect that trauma. The insistence that history must be orderly and linear is a modern preference, not a natural law. Nature does not operate smoothly. Evolution is punctuated. Climate shifts abruptly. Civilizations rise and fall suddenly. Expecting the past to conform to tidy narratives ignores this reality. As evidence accumulates, the distance between ancient memory and modern reconstruction narrows. Each discovery forces reconsideration of assumptions. Each anomaly invites humility. The story of humanity grows deeper, older, and less comfortable. This does not diminish human achievement. It contextualizes it. Survival after catastrophe, reconstruction without guidance, and gradual recovery are accomplishments in themselves. Civilization becomes not a triumph over ignorance, but a testament to resilience. In this light, ancient accounts of intervention, giants, and lost knowledge need not be accepted literally to be respected. They represent humanity's attempt to make sense of forces beyond its control. They preserve truth in form rather than detail. The task now is not to choose between myth and science, but to allow them to inform each other. Where one offers structure, the other offers mechanism. Where one preserves memory, the other tests possibility. As this integration progresses, the past becomes less of a battleground and more of a landscape, layered, uneven, and rich with traces. The story of human origins expands beyond simplistic beginnings into a complex tapestry of interaction, disruption, and endurance. And within that tapestry, the ancient voices once dismissed begin to sound less like fantasy and more like witnesses, speaking across time from a world profoundly changed, asking not for belief, but for careful listening. As humanity entered an age defined by technology and data, a subtle reversal began to occur. The very tools designed to distance modern thought from ancient myth started uncovering patterns that those myths had preserved. Satellites mapped terrain hidden beneath jungle canopies. Sonar revealed structures drowned under continental shelves. Genetic sequencing exposed ancestries more tangled than linear descent had suggested. Instead of simplifying history, precision made it stranger. One of the most disruptive revelations came from the realization that many ancient sites were not isolated achievements, but components of larger systems. Roads, canals, and settlements appeared connected across regions now separated by sea or desert. These networks implied planning on a scale difficult to reconcile with the populations officially assigned to them. Infrastructure does not arise from improvisation. It requires coordination, foresight, and authority. When coastlines were reconstructed according to prehistoric sea levels, patterns emerged that ancient maps seemed to anticipate. Submerged landmasses corresponded to mythic homelands, described as lost to flood or fire. These were not vague references to destruction, but specific descriptions of islands, plains, and river systems that no longer exist above water. The alignment between narrative and geology suggested memory rather than imagination. Technological analysis of ancient artifacts further complicated accepted timelines. Precision drilling, symmetrical machining, and material processing techniques appeared in objects dated far earlier than such capabilities were supposed to exist. Explanations invoking coincidence or lost methods addressed how these artifacts might have been produced, but not why such sophistication appeared sporadically rather than continuously. This sporadic pattern mirrors ancient accounts of intervention followed by withdrawal. Knowledge appears abruptly, then fragments. Capabilities spike, then diminish. Humanity inherits remnants without instruction. The technological record reflects this uneven distribution, challenging the assumption that progress must be cumulative. Modern attempts to reconstruct these techniques often reveal an uncomfortable truth. Some ancient methods are difficult to replicate, even with contemporary tools. This does not imply impossibility, but it does imply a depth of understanding not easily inferred from simple trial and error. Mastery suggests instruction, not discovery. At the same time, space exploration reshaped humanity's perspective on its own planet. Seeing Earth as a fragile sphere suspended in darkness altered assumptions about isolation and uniqueness. The idea that advanced life could exist elsewhere no longer belonged solely to speculation. It became a statistical consideration. This shift reopened interpretations of ancient accounts describing beings from the sky. Reframed through this lens, references to watchers and teachers acquire new plausibility without requiring literal acceptance. They may describe encounters with non-local intelligences, advanced cultures, or technologies perceived as divine by less developed observers. The language of gods becomes a translation of experience rather than a claim of omnipotence. This perspective does not validate every ancient claim. It reframes them as data points filtered through human perception. Ancient people described what they saw using the concepts available to them. Modern people do the same. The difference lies not in accuracy, but in vocabulary. Resistance to this reframing often stems from fear of destabilization. Accepting that humanity's past may include interaction with advanced forces challenges narratives of self-sufficiency. It undermines the idea that intelligence inevitably progresses from simplicity to complexity without interruption. Yet evidence increasingly suggests that interruption is the rule rather than the exception. Climate instability, resource depletion, and external shocks repeatedly reset development. Civilizations rise, peak, and collapse. Knowledge is lost and rediscovered. The present era may not be unique in this regard. Ancient accounts preserve awareness of this fragility. They warn of cycles rather than permanence. They emphasize balance over dominance. When balance is lost, correction follows. This worldview contrasts sharply with modern assumptions of control and predictability. The implications extend beyond history. If humanity's trajectory has been shaped by forces beyond its awareness before, it may be again. The silence of the sky does not guarantee absence. It may reflect distance, timing, or restraint. Ancient stories often describe departure rather than destruction, withdrawal rather than annihilation. This possibility unsettles because it reframes humanity's role. Instead of protagonists in a self-authored narrative, humans become participants in a larger system whose rules they only partially grasp. Progress becomes conditional. Survival becomes adaptive rather than guaranteed. The convergence of ancient memory and modern discovery does not point toward a single conclusion. It opens a field of inquiry. The past is no longer a closed chapter. It is an active variable influencing interpretation of the present. This convergence also exposes the limits of reductionism. No single discipline can reconstruct a past this complex. Geology explains terrain. Archaeology explains structure. Genetics explains lineage. Myth explains memory. Each alone is incomplete. Together they form a mosaic. The reluctance to assemble that mosaic reflects institutional inertia more than evidentiary weakness. Paradigms shift slowly. But history shows that when enough anomalies accumulate, resistance collapses suddenly. What was once fringe becomes foundational. In such moments, old texts are reread, ruins are re-examined, assumptions are revised, the past expands. Humanity now stands at the edge of such a revision. The tools exist, the data grows. The question is no longer whether ancient people remembered something different, but whether modern society is willing to interpret that memory without prejudice. This willingness does not require abandoning skepticism. It requires redirecting it. Doubt should challenge assumptions, not protect them. Inquiry should expand possibility, not enforce comfort. If ancient narratives encode experiences of contact, catastrophe, and loss, then they are not relics of superstition. They are records of survival. They testify to a world that changed faster and more violently than modern history often admits. Understanding that world does not diminish humanity. It situates it. It reveals resilience rather than inevitability. Civilization becomes a response to trauma as much as an expression of creativity. As the layers of history peel back, a picture emerges of a species shaped not only by gradual adaptation, but by sudden disruption and inherited constraint. The story of humanity grows less heroic, but more honest. And within that honesty lies a deeper respect for the voices of the past. Voices that did not intend to mislead, but to remember. Preserving through story what could not be preserved through stone. Waiting for a future capable of listening again. As the accumulated weight of evidence presses against the boundaries of accepted history, attention inevitably turns to the question of control. Not control in the modern political sense, but control over narrative, over what is permitted to be remembered and how that memory is shaped. Throughout human history, power has never relied solely on force. It has relied on framing the past in ways that stabilize the present. When earlier civilizations collapsed, they did not merely lose cities and populations. They lost interpretive authority. Survivors inherited ruins without manuals, technologies without context, and stories without full comprehension. In that vacuum, meaning had to be rebuilt. Those who controlled explanation controlled legitimacy. This dynamic repeated itself whenever empires rose atop the remains of older worlds. Sacred texts became one of the most effective tools for this process. By defining origin, purpose, and destiny, they provided a coherent worldview that reduced uncertainty. Ambiguity was dangerous. A population that believes its ancestors were guided by external forces might question why those forces no longer intervene, or whether they might return. Certainty, even if simplified, was safer than openness. As a result, narratives that emphasized divine distance over proximity were favored. The sky became unreachable, authority became absolute. The idea that knowledge could arrive from outside humanity was replaced with the idea that truth had already been fully delivered. Revelation closed. History froze into doctrine. This closure is visible in how alternative accounts were treated. Texts that described direct contact, instruction, or physical interaction with powerful non-human beings were labeled symbolic, corrupted, or dangerous. Their exclusion was framed as purification rather than censorship. What remained was a streamlined story that supported obedience and continuity. The psychological effect of this streamlining was profound. Humanity's relationship with the unknown shifted from engagement to submission. Curiosity became something to discipline rather than encourage. Questions about origin were redirected toward morality rather than mechanism. The past was no longer a field to explore, but a lesson to absorb. Yet suppression never fully succeeds. What is removed from official record often resurfaces in peripheral forms. Folklore, esoteric traditions, and underground texts preserved elements deemed unacceptable in mainstream discourse. These fragments did not form a unified alternative history, but they retained themes too persistent to erase. One such theme is return. Ancient narratives rarely describe disappearance as final. Departure is followed by promise, often vague, sometimes conditional. The forces that once intervened withdraw, but they are not destroyed. They watch from a distance, bound by rules or cycles beyond human control. This idea appears repeatedly across cultures, even where direct contact narratives have been softened. The persistence of this motif influences how later societies interpret the future. Apocalyptic expectations, messianic returns, and cycles of renewal echo the same structure. Humanity waits, consciously or not, for a rebalancing event that will correct accumulated error. Progress becomes provisional, always subject to reset. Modern secular culture has not escaped this pattern. It has simply translated it. Instead of gods, it anticipates technological singularities. Instead of divine judgment, it fears ecological collapse. Instead of heavenly return, it imagines extraterrestrial contact. The structure remains intact. Only the language changes. This continuity suggests that the human mind retains a deep template shaped by ancient experience. Whether that experience involved literal contact or symbolic interpretation, it left an imprint. Humanity expects interruption. It anticipates correction. It senses that its current state is not final. Attempts to dismiss this as psychological projection ignore its historical consistency. Civilizations separated by oceans and millennia developed the same expectations independently. This convergence points toward shared memory rather than shared imagination. Institutional resistance to exploring this convergence often rests on a desire to protect modern identity. Humanity prefers to see itself as the sole author of its progress. Acknowledging dependence, interruption, or external influence complicates narratives of mastery and destiny. Yet complexity does not negate agency. It contextualizes it. Acknowledging that humanity may have been shaped by forces beyond itself does not render it passive. It highlights adaptation, resilience, and learning under constraint. Survival becomes achievement. As contemporary research continues to uncover anomalies, the pressure to revisit excluded narratives increases. Each new discovery forces re-evaluation of what was considered impossible or irrelevant. History grows less certain, but more accurate. This process is uncomfortable because it dissolves boundaries. Science edges closer to myth. Myth edges closer to data. The clear lines that once separated belief from evidence blur. In their place emerges a more integrated understanding of how humans remember, interpret, and transmit experience. The fear underlying resistance to this integration is not irrational. Revising origins reshapes identity. It challenges assumptions about uniqueness, superiority, and inevitability. It raises questions about future vulnerability. If humanity has faced reset before, it may face it again. Ancient accounts do not present this prospect as hopeless. They emphasize continuity through preparation, adaptation, and humility. Those who survive catastrophe are not the strongest or most advanced, but the most attentive. They listen. They remember. They adjust. This lesson resonates strongly in a world facing its own thresholds. Climate instability, technological acceleration, and ecological strain echo earlier patterns of imbalance. The past ceases to be distant. It becomes instructive. Re-examining ancient narratives through this lens transforms them from curiosities into warnings. They are not instructions to worship forgotten powers, but reminders of limits. They caution against assuming permanence in systems that depend on balance. What was once framed as divine punishment can be reinterpreted as systemic correction. When thresholds are crossed, consequences follow. This principle applies regardless of whether one invokes gods, nature, or physics. The language differs. The outcome does not. The value of ancient memory lies not in literal replication, but in pattern recognition. It teaches humanity to recognize early signs of imbalance and respond before correction becomes catastrophic. It encourages humility in the face of complexity. In this way, the suppressed narratives regain relevance. They do not undermine modern knowledge. They enrich it. They offer long-term perspective unavailable through short-term data alone. As humanity moves forward, the choice is not between belief and skepticism, but between denial and integration. The past cannot be made simpler by ignoring its contradictions. It can only be understood by confronting them. Part 11 marks a point where the accumulated threads of memory, evidence, and resistance converge. The question is no longer whether the old stories were meaningful, but whether modern civilization is prepared to learn from them without repeating the conditions that once made forgetting necessary. The most revealing moments in this story are not the grand declarations carved into temples or preserved in Scripture, but the quiet contradictions that survive in plain sight. A civilization will claim its gods are purely spiritual, yet it will build platforms aligned with the sky as if expecting something physical to arrive. A tradition will insist the Golden Age was symbolic, yet it will preserve measurements and ratios so exact they can be tested millennia later. A culture will deny rupture, yet it will carry the same flood memory like an old scar across continents that never shared a coastline. These contradictions are not mistakes. They are seams where two versions of the past were stitched together and never fully reconciled. One seam appears in the way early societies treated mountains, caves, and high places. In the oldest layers, these are not just sacred locations. They are points of access, places where contact was believed to have occurred, and where it might occur again. The language of descending and ascending is not framed as moral aspiration at first. It is framed as movement. Later eras convert that movement into metaphor because metaphor is safer. But the geography remains the same. The same peaks are marked, The same caves are avoided. The same remote ridges are treated as thresholds rather than scenery. Another theme appears in the obsession with gates and boundaries in ancient cosmologies. Winds are said to pass through gates. Stars follow paths constrained by unseen borders. Waters are held back by limits that can fail. To modern ears, this sounds mythic, yet it mirrors a mind trying to describe systems, atmospheric circulation, predictable celestial motion, and hydrological thresholds. The ancients did not speak in equations. They spoke in architecture. The world was built, therefore the world had doors, locks, and rules. This architectural way of thinking extended into governance. When kings claimed authority, they did not claim to be self-made. They claimed to be installed, chosen, or permitted. Rituals of enthronement often reenacted a transfer of power from a higher order. Even when no higher order visibly appeared, the ceremony preserved the impression that rule was conditional, that leadership existed under oversight. It is a political technology designed to stabilize societies haunted by older memories of rulers who were not human. The priesthood becomes crucial here, not merely as spiritual guides, but as managers of continuity. They controlled calendars, which controlled agriculture, which controlled survival. They controlled writing, which controlled debt and law. They controlled ritual, which controlled fear. In exchange, they offered the population a promise: stability through obedience. But embedded in their control was an implicit confession that stability was not natural. It had to be manufactured because something in the world's history had proven that collapse was always possible. This manufactured stability required the careful handling of certain ideas. The more literal accounts of earlier intervention, teachers from the sky, rulers of great longevity, beings whose bodies carried abnormal scale, were not merely embarrassing, they were destabilizing. They implied that human authority was provisional, that knowledge could arrive from outside the institution, and that catastrophe could be triggered by forces beyond moral discipline. These implications threatened the entire system. So the stories were refined. The physical became spiritual. The technical became ethical. The disruptive became allegorical. Yet suppression leaves residue, and residue accumulates in odd places. In some traditions, specific numbers persist like fingerprints, units of time based on unusual divisions, measurements repeated across sacred complexes, ratios that align architecture to celestial cycles. These are not devotional flourishes. They are operational remnants. They suggest that at some earlier stage, knowledge was transmitted with a precision that later generations preserved without fully understanding. The same is true of certain materials and methods: stone blocks cut with uncanny regularity, jointing techniques that lock structures together without mortar, megaliths positioned in ways that exploit gravity and friction with remarkable efficiency. These features appear in ancient sites that span geography and culture. The builders may have used different tools, but the logic feels shared, as if the method was inherited as a template. Later builders imitate the forms, but the precision often fades. This is the opposite of what one would expect from steady progress. It resembles loss. Loss has a particular shape in human memory. When a capability disappears, it is often recast as magic. When a teacher departs, their instruction becomes myth. When a catastrophe erases context, survivors preserve what they can in story. and story quickly becomes moralized because morality is the easiest glue to hold a shattered world together. People can debate mechanisms, but they can agree on lessons. A world that has been drowned or burned does not first ask for equations. It asks for meaning. That is how the flood becomes more than water. It becomes a warning about excess. The giants become more than bodies. They become a warning about imbalance. The watchers become more than observers. They become a warning about knowledge without restraint. Each transformation keeps the core pattern alive, while stripping away details that might provoke panic or rebellion. Modern audiences often misunderstand this moralization as evidence that the stories were never literal. But moralization is exactly what happens to literal experience when it must be carried across generations without stable institutions. A village that survives an earthquake does not pass down seismology. It passes down the memory that certain ground moves and certain signs precede disaster. It wraps that memory in ritual and taboo because ritual is durable. Over time, the ritual becomes the focus, and the original observation becomes faint. Yet the taboo still points toward something real. The same dynamic may explain why certain questions keep resurfacing. If the past contains a rupture large enough to be remembered globally, it would not disappear simply because modern education prefers clean timelines. It would keep leaking through in artifacts that do not fit, in traditions that refuse to die, in structures that behave like equations carved into stone. People would feel the leak as unease, as suspicion that the official story is missing rooms, hidden corridors, locked doors. This unease is not childish, it is adaptive. A species that survived repeated disruption would develop instincts for pattern recognition. It would sense when narratives are too smooth. It would look for seams. It would distrust absolute certainty, because certainty is the posture of those who have not been burned by history. Ancient cultures, shaped by catastrophe, did not worship certainty. They built redundancy, multiple myths, multiple rites, multiple calendars, because redundancy is how you survive when systems fail. The modern world, despite its technology, is not exempt from failure. It is more connected, more complex, and therefore more vulnerable to cascading collapse. A single shock can ripple across supply chains, communications, and energy systems. In such a world, the ancient obsession with balance and limits begins to look less like superstition and more like hard-won strategy. The deeper implication is not that humanity should abandon modern knowledge for ancient myth. It is that ancient myth may contain compressed records of systemic behavior that modern civilization is rediscovering the hard way. Thresholds exist, feedback loops punish arrogance, and power without restraint accelerates collapse. Whether the first great rupture was triggered by climate, conflict, intervention, or some combination of forces, the lesson encoded across cultures is consistent. When the world's balance is treated as limitless, the world corrects. In that sense, the oldest stories are not trying to lure anyone into fantasy. They are trying to keep a memory alive long enough for a future civilization, one with better tools and wider perspective, to recognize the pattern and act before the next correction becomes total. They preserved the warning because they had already lived through what happens when the warning is ignored. As humanity moved deeper into the modern age, the tension between inherited memory and engineered certainty intensified. The more systems were built to explain the world in totality, the more resistant those systems became to irregularities. History was expected to behave like a solved equation, with variables neatly accounted for and anomalies reduced to noise. Yet the deeper archives of the past refused to conform. They behaved less like a line and more like a fault zone, where pressure accumulated invisibly until it surfaced through cracks. One of the most persistent cracks appears in the treatment of time itself. Official chronology relies on calibrated sequences, measured by layers, decay rates, and typologies. These tools are powerful, but they assume continuity. Ancient traditions, by contrast, describe time as punctuated, marked by breaks so severe that what came before and after belonged to different orders of existence. These breaks are not treated as minor disruptions. They are boundaries beyond which normal comparison fails. This difference in temporal perception explains why ancient records often appear exaggerated to modern readers. Lifespans stretch beyond biological expectation. Reigns last longer than dynasties. Ages span impossibly long durations. Yet these descriptions may not be attempts at literal measurement. They may be attempts to signal discontinuity. When an era ends completely, when its inhabitants, technologies, and structures vanish, the past becomes immeasurable by ordinary standards. Time before rupture feels qualitatively different, larger, heavier. Modern science encounters a similar problem when dealing with deep time. Geological epochs are defined not by smooth transition, but by extinction events. A thin layer of sediment can mark the end of a world. Before and after are not directly comparable. Ancient storytellers lacked stratigraphy, but they understood rupture. They encoded it in scale. This perspective reframes claims of ancient longevity and greatness. They need not imply individual immortality. They may indicate a class of existence no longer accessible. A world with different environmental conditions, biological constraints, or technological mediation would feel vast compared to the one that followed. Survivors would remember it as an age of giants because everything about it exceeded the reduced scale of the aftermath. Another crack emerges in the persistence of global coordination before global contact. Monumental sites across continents share orientation, proportional systems, and symbolic geometry. These similarities do not require a single ruling empire. They require a shared framework, a set of principles transmitted before cultural divergence hardened into isolation. Once that framework was lost, later civilizations inherited fragments and interpreted them locally. Modern mapping technologies have intensified this puzzle. When ancient sites are plotted against reconstructed night skies, alignments emerge that would have required accurate long-term observation. These alignments are not decorative. They encode cycles of return, markers of continuity in a world expected to change. This suggests that ancient builders anticipated loss. They prepared messages not for posterity, but for recurrence. This anticipation of recurrence also appears in how ancient cultures treated knowledge. They did not assume it would accumulate indefinitely. They assumed it would decay. As a result, they prioritized resilience over expansion. Knowledge was distributed across ritual, architecture, myth, and practice. If one channel failed, another might survive. This redundancy appears inefficient by modern standards, but it is optimal for surviving collapse. The modern emphasis on centralized storage and specialization runs counter to this ancient logic. Data is consolidated, expertise is compartmentalized, efficiency is maximized. This produces immense short-term power and long-term fragility. When systems fail, recovery becomes difficult because redundancy has been stripped away. Ancient memory reflects this understanding. The collapse of earlier ages is attributed not merely to external catastrophe, but to overconcentration. Too much power in too few hands. Too much knowledge without restraint. Too much extraction without regeneration. These themes recur regardless of culture, suggesting observation rather than invention. The disappearance of the earlier guiding presence, however interpreted, forced humanity into self-regulation. The stories emphasize that this transition was not smooth. It required suffering, discipline, and repeated failure. Civilization learned slowly because it had to. The luxury of external correction was gone. Mistakes now carried full consequence. This shift may explain the emergence of ethical systems that prioritize humility, moderation, and responsibility. These are not abstract virtues. They are survival adaptations. A species that has experienced systemic reset will embed caution into its moral code. Excess becomes sin. Balance becomes righteousness. These concepts are not metaphysical. They are practical. As modern societies confront global-scale challenges, these ancient adaptations become visible again. Climate instability mirrors earlier descriptions of imbalance. Resource depletion echoes warnings against overreach. Technological acceleration resembles the ancient fear of knowledge arriving faster than wisdom can adapt. The instinctive resistance to these parallels often stems from discomfort. Modern civilization prides itself on novelty. It prefers to believe it faces unprecedented challenges with unprecedented tools. Acknowledging that similar patterns have played out before undermines that sense of uniqueness. Yet uniqueness does not guarantee immunity. Ancient narratives do not claim that collapse is inevitable. They claim it is conditional. Balance maintained prevents correction. Balance ignored invites it. This conditionality places responsibility squarely on behavior rather than destiny. It empowers adaptation without promising safety. The lingering presence of watchers, teachers, or overseers in ancient memory may symbolize the period when correction was external. Their withdrawal marks the moment when responsibility transferred fully to humanity. From that point forward, mistakes would not be fixed by intervention. They would be learned through consequence. This interpretation aligns with the gradual hardening of natural law in human thought. Early accounts describe negotiation with forces that respond. Later accounts describe immutable systems that do not care. Gravity does not bargain. Climate does not forgive. Civilization adapts or suffers. Seen this way, the ancient world was not more magical. It was more relational. Forces were personalized because their behavior was not yet predictable. As predictability increased, personalization faded. The gods retreated not because they were disproven, but because they were replaced by models. Yet models have limits. When systems grow too complex, prediction fails again. Uncertainty returns. The world begins to behave less like an equation and more like a personality. In those moments, ancient memory becomes relevant once more, offering patterns where precision fails. Part 13 settles into this recognition. The past is not a curiosity to be solved, but a resource to be interpreted. Its contradictions are not errors. They are signals of transitions too large to be captured cleanly. Humanity stands not at the end of history, but within a recurring structure shaped by balance, disruption, and recovery. The old stories persist because they describe that structure. They survive because collapse selects for memory that warns. And they wait, not to be believed blindly, but to be understood at the moment when understanding becomes necessary. As the narrative approaches the present, a subtle inversion takes place. For most of recorded history, humanity looked backward for explanation, grounding identity in origins, ancestors, and lost ages. In the modern era, the gaze shifts forward. The future becomes the dominant reference point. Progress replaces memory. Innovation replaces inheritance. Yet beneath this forward momentum, the same ancient structures quietly reassert themselves. Modern societies are built on systems whose complexity rivals anything described in ancient accounts. Energy grids span continents. Information moves faster than cognition can track. Supply chains bind distant populations into a single organism. This interconnectedness produces power, but it also reproduces the conditions ancient traditions warned against. Imbalance amplified by scale. What changes is perception. Where ancient cultures framed imbalance in mythic language, modern civilization frames it statistically. Risk models replace omens. Forecasts replace prophecy. Yet the underlying concern is identical. When thresholds are crossed, systems behave unpredictably. Correction follows disruption, not intention. This similarity becomes clearer when examining how modern collapse scenarios are described. Climate tipping points, cascading failures, systemic shocks. The language is technical, but the structure mirrors ancient warnings. The world tolerates pressure until it does not. Once limits are exceeded, reversal accelerates. Recovery, if possible, requires contraction and adaptation. Ancient memory preserved this pattern through story because story communicates consequence intuitively. Modern models communicate probability, but struggle to convey lived impact. A graph does not burn villages. A legend does. This difference explains why ancient warnings endured despite lacking precision. They spoke directly to survival. In recent decades, renewed interest in ancient cycles reflects a growing discomfort with linear optimism. Technological confidence remains high, but trust in permanence declines. People sense that progress without restraint may be repeating an old trajectory. The past begins to feel relevant not as nostalgia, but as precedent. This relevance reshapes how ancient narratives are interpreted. The watchers become symbols of external acceleration. Giants become embodiments of disproportionate consumption. Floods become representations of systemic reset. These translations do not deny literal possibility, they extend applicability. At the same time, scientific discovery continues to erode the assumption that humanity is isolated. The search for life beyond Earth reframes the sky not as empty, but as potentially inhabited. Exoplanets are catalogued. Chemical signatures suggest biological processes elsewhere. The idea that intelligence exists beyond humanity moves from speculation toward probability. This shift retroactively alters how ancient accounts are read. Descriptions of beings descending from the sky no longer sound automatically absurd. They become hypotheses, neither proven nor dismissed outright. The language of gods becomes one possible encoding of encounter. What matters is not confirmation, but openness. Ancient texts cease to be ridiculed and begin to be questioned seriously. Questioning does not mean believing. It means recognizing that the past may have experienced phenomena modern frameworks are only beginning to consider. This openness extends to archaeology. Sites once considered anomalous are re-examined with new tools. Precision dating, ground-penetrating radar, and material analysis reveal complexity previously overlooked. Each revelation adds texture to the past, making it harder to flatten into simple progression. As complexity increases, so does humility. The confidence that modern civilization fully understands its origins weakens. In its place emerges a recognition that history is provisional, always subject to revision as new evidence emerges. This humility echoes ancient caution. The oldest traditions rarely claimed certainty. They emphasized respect for forces beyond comprehension. Modern science, when operating at its best, exhibits similar restraint. It acknowledges uncertainty. It revises models. It accepts limits. The convergence of these attitudes marks a turning point. Ancient memory and modern method begin to align, not in content, but in posture. Both recognize that complexity demands care. This alignment does not guarantee wisdom. It creates opportunity. Whether humanity uses that opportunity depends on its willingness to integrate lessons rather than repeat patterns. The ancient world collapsed under pressures it could not regulate. The modern world faces pressures of unprecedented scale. The difference lies in awareness. Humanity now possesses tools to detect imbalance early. It can model futures. It can choose contraction over collapse. But awareness does not equal action. Ancient narratives emphasize this distinction repeatedly. Knowledge without restraint accelerates failure. This warning resonates strongly in an age of exponential growth. Technology amplifies intention. Systems magnify error. A small miscalculation propagates globally. The margin for recovery narrows. In this context, ancient memory serves as ballast. It slows momentum. It introduces pause. It reminds humanity that progress without balance is not advancement, but accumulation of risk. The enduring presence of flood myths, lost ages, and withdrawn teachers reflects a collective understanding that stability is fragile. These stories survived not because they were entertaining, but because they encoded survival strategies. They taught communities to expect change, to prepare for loss, and to rebuild with restraint. As humanity stands at another threshold, these strategies regain relevance. The question is no longer whether ancient people were right in detail. It is whether they were right in pattern. Part 14 crystallizes this realization. The past is not behind humanity. It is beneath it, supporting or undermining depending on how its lessons are used. Memory becomes infrastructure. Ignored, it erodes. Integrated, it stabilizes. The ancient world did not leave behind blueprints for machines. It left behind warnings about behavior. Those warnings are now legible in modern terms. They speak of limits, cycles, and responsibility. Whether humanity listens will determine whether the next great correction becomes a controlled transition or another catastrophic reset. The stories have already shown both outcomes. The choice has never been abstract. It has always been practical, made in how societies balance power, knowledge, and restraint. In that balance lies the true inheritance of the past, not as myth or prophecy, but as accumulated experience waiting to be applied. As the arc of this history narrows toward conclusion, the fragments long treated as anomalies begin to behave like components of a single system. What once appeared as disconnected myths, unexplained ruins, suppressed texts, and recurring catastrophes now align into a pattern defined not by fantasy, but by continuity under stress. Humanity's story does not unfold as an uninterrupted ascent, but as a sequence of adaptations shaped by loss, restraint, and partial remembrance. The most consistent feature of this pattern is not collapse itself, but survival after collapse. Civilizations do not vanish completely. They contract, they simplify, they preserve what they can, and discard what they must. Knowledge narrows, scale reduces, ambition recalibrates. This process leaves behind a distorted memory of what came before, magnified by contrast and moralized by necessity. In this light, the ancient accounts of lost ages and withdrawn overseers describe not disappearance, but transition. A world operating under one set of conditions gives way to another operating under tighter constraints. The former appears godlike only because its capacities exceeded what followed. The latter appears humble because it is learning to function without external correction. What modern civilization often misunderstands is that this transition was not experienced as progress. It was experienced as limitation. Humanity moved from proximity to distance, from instruction to inference, from participation in a larger order to observation of its remnants. This shift required psychological adaptation as much as material reconstruction. Religion, law, and custom evolved to stabilize this new condition. They discouraged reckless expansion and enforced boundaries because the memory of excess was still close enough to hurt. Over time, as memory faded, boundaries loosened, innovation resumed, complexity increased, the cycle restarted. This is why ancient traditions insist on recurrence. They are not predicting apocalypse, they are describing behavior. When balance erodes, correction follows. When restraint fails, systems collapse. The timing varies. The mechanism varies. The pattern does not. Modern civilization exhibits all the markers ancient accounts associate with late-stage imbalance. Resource extraction exceeds regeneration. Systems optimize for efficiency at the expense of resilience. Knowledge accelerates faster than governance can adapt. Centralization intensifies vulnerability. These are not moral judgments. They are structural conditions. Ancient memory framed these conditions in language of sin, hubris, and judgment, because those were the available tools for shaping behavior. Modern analysis frames them as sustainability, risk management, and systemic fragility. The vocabulary changes. The warning does not. What makes the present moment distinct is scale. Humanity now operates at planetary capacity. Its actions alter climate, oceans, and ecosystems. The consequences of imbalance propagate globally. There is no unconnected margin left to absorb failure quietly. Correction, if triggered, will be comprehensive. This reality lends urgency to ancient insights. They are no longer distant curiosities. They are long-term case studies in systemic behavior. They document what happens when complexity outpaces restraint, when power is applied without proportion, when memory is ignored. The ancient emphasis on humility emerges not as submission, but as calibration. Knowing when to stop, when to rest, when to decentralize, and when to limit growth are survival strategies, not virtues for their own sake. They keep systems within recoverable bounds. Modern culture often equates limitation with defeat. Ancient cultures understood limitation as continuity. Expansion without pause leads to brittleness. Restraint preserves flexibility. This principle appears in architecture designed to endure earthquakes, in agriculture rotated to preserve soil, and in social systems structured to distribute power. As modern systems strain under accumulated pressure, rediscovering these principles becomes essential, not through nostalgia, but through translation. Ancient memory must be expressed in contemporary terms to regain function. Cycles become models. Balance becomes policy. Restraint becomes design. The question of ancient intervention, whether literal or symbolic, recedes in importance at this stage. What matters is not who or what corrected imbalance in the past, but that imbalance was corrected regardless of belief. The system responded. It always does. Humanity's advantage now lies in foresight. Unlike earlier civilizations, it can see patterns across millennia. It can recognize repetition. It can choose adjustment before collapse becomes inevitable. This capacity does not guarantee success, but it creates possibility. The danger lies in assuming immunity. Every civilization that collapsed believed itself exceptional. Each believed its tools, gods, or structures would prevent failure. Ancient memory preserves this irony repeatedly. Confidence precedes correction. Understanding this does not require abandoning progress. It requires redefining it. Progress measured solely by expansion and output is incomplete. Progress measured by resilience, adaptability, and continuity aligns with long-term survival. In this reframing, ancient narratives regain clarity. They are not relics of ignorance. They are records of civilizations grappling with forces larger than themselves, using the language they had to encode lessons they hoped would endure. Their success is evident in the fact that those lessons still surface. As this narrative reaches its final threshold, what emerges is not a verdict on the past, but a mirror for the present. Humanity stands where others have stood before, armed with greater reach and greater risk. The difference lies in awareness. Whether awareness becomes action remains unresolved. Ancient memory does not guarantee wisdom. It offers opportunity. The same opportunity now exists, magnified by scale and consequence. The story does not end with revelation or certainty. It ends with responsibility. The past does not demand belief. It demands attention. It asks that patterns be recognized and applied before correction becomes irreversible. Civilization has inherited not just ruins and myths, but accumulated experience encoded in story, stone, and silence. To ignore that inheritance is to repeat history blindly. To integrate it is to step beyond repetition into informed choice. The final measure of progress will not be how far humanity reaches, but how long it endures without erasing itself. That measure has always been implicit in the oldest stories. It remains implicit now, waiting not for discovery, but for application. At the far edge of this reconstruction, what remains is not a single revelation, but a reframing of what history is allowed to be. The past no longer appears as a settled account with loose ends to be trimmed away. It appears as an active system, one that continues to exert pressure on the present, whether acknowledged or not. The ruins, myths, measurements, and silences do not argue with one another. They converge. What emerges most clearly is that humanity has never existed in a vacuum. Its development has always been shaped by forces larger than individual intention, whether environmental, systemic, or external. Ancient cultures recognized this intuitively. They described the world as responsive, governed by limits that could be tested but not ignored. Their stories did not flatter human dominance, they warned against it. The disappearance of earlier guiding forces, however interpreted, marks the defining condition of human civilization. From that point forward, humanity operated without oversight it could recognize, forced to infer rules from consequence rather than instruction. This transition was not framed as liberation. It was framed as risk. Freedom arrived without guarantees. Modern civilization inherits that same condition, but at an unprecedented scale. Humanity now modifies planetary systems, not local environments. It commands energies that reshape landscapes and climates. The absence of visible correction does not imply safety. Ancient memory insists that correction often arrives late when imbalance has already propagated beyond containment. This understanding dissolves the false divide between ancient myth and modern science. Both attempt to describe interaction between human behavior and larger systems. One speaks in story, the other in model. One encodes memory, the other predicts outcome. Together, they form a more complete language. What ancient narratives contribute is perspective across collapse. They record not only how systems fail, but how survivors adapt afterward. They emphasize contraction, decentralization, and humility as pathways through disruption. They do not celebrate dominance, they celebrate continuity. The modern tendency to treat collapse as an endpoint misunderstands this emphasis. Collapse is a transition, not an extinction, provided adaptation occurs. The danger lies not in disruption itself, but in refusing to adjust when warning signs appear. Ancient memory is explicit on this point. The repeated appearance of floods, fires, lost ages, and withdrawn teachers reflects not obsession, but data compression. These motifs capture recurring outcomes of imbalance. They persist because they are reliable. They are retained because they remain relevant. As modern society confronts thresholds once thought distant, these motifs acquire new clarity. Climate instability echoes flood memory. Technological acceleration echoes premature knowledge. Resource depletion echoes overreach. The parallels are structural, not symbolic. The question of whether ancient accounts describe literal beings from the sky becomes secondary here. What matters is that humanity has repeatedly experienced periods where capacity outpaced restraint. Whether the catalyst was environmental, technological, or external, the result followed the same pattern. Expansion exceeded balance. Correction followed. Recognizing this pattern does not require belief. It requires attention. The ancient world did not preserve these stories to inspire awe. It preserved them to prevent repetition. Their failure to prevent it entirely does not negate their value. It underscores the difficulty of the task. Modern civilization now holds advantages unavailable to earlier societies. It can observe globally, model futures, and communicate instantly. These tools do not guarantee wisdom, but they expand the window for response. They allow adjustment before collapse becomes total. The obstacle is not ignorance, it is inertia. Systems optimized for growth resist limitation. Institutions built on expansion struggle to embrace restraint. Ancient memory identifies this resistance as the final stage before correction. Confidence hardens. Warning becomes noise. The purpose of revisiting suppressed narratives, anomalous evidence, and fragmented memory is not to romanticize the past. It is to restore dimensionality to the present. A civilization that understands its history as cyclical prepares differently than one that believes itself linear. This preparation does not involve prophecy or fear. It involves design. Systems built to flex rather than fracture. Governance capable of revision. Technology paired with ethics. Growth aligned with regeneration. These are not ancient fantasies. They are practical responses to patterns observed repeatedly over thousands of years. The final lesson encoded in the oldest traditions is not that humanity is doomed. It is that humanity is responsible. Once external correction withdraws, self-correction becomes the only alternative. This responsibility is difficult, unevenly applied, and often delayed. But it is unavoidable. History, when stripped of simplification, offers no guarantee of progress. It offers only precedent. The same choices recur under different conditions. The same outcomes follow when patterns are repeated. The advantage of memory lies in recognizing repetition before consequence enforces learning. As this reconstruction closes, the narrative returns not to the sky, but to the ground, to how societies are structured, to how resources are treated, to how limits are respected or ignored. These decisions determine whether the next transition is survivable. The ancient world left behind no final answers. It left behind a record of what happens when answers are assumed too early. That record is incomplete by design, shaped by survival rather than precision. Yet its consistency across cultures gives it weight. Civilization now stands in possession of both ancient memory and modern method. The separation between them is artificial. Integration is possible. Whether it occurs will shape what survives into whatever follows. The story does not end with certainty or closure. It ends with choice. The past has spoken as clearly as it can, through stone, silence, and repetition. What happens next will determine whether those messages become warnings heeded or lessons relearned at greater cost. In that sense, history remains unfinished. Not because it lacks data, but because its outcome depends, as it always has, on how humanity responds when balance begins to slip, and whether it remembers in time why the last world fell.